Benvenute e benvenuti a tutti, siamo davvero molto lieti di avere di nuovo nostra ospite Sara Sallam, che è possiamo dire un'artista che ha molto riflettuto sulla collezione del Museo Egizio, e questo speech, questa presentazione si inserisce all'interno di due importanti palinsesti. Siamo molto lieti in effetti di questa duplice, patrocinio, da una parte Exposed e dall'altra la presentazione si inserisce anche all'interno del contesto del Salone del Libro Off, che oggi vede la chiusura. L'intervento sarà in lingua inglese, ma qui in sala appunto sarà tradotto in maniera simultanea. Ci sarà lo spazio per le domande. Abbiamo assieme a Sara Sallam Paolo del Vesco, che è curatore qui al Museo Egizio. Ci sarà appunto uno spazio per le domande e alla fine potrete visitare liberamente l'installazione dell'artista di Sara Sallam e Galleria dei Re, con la quale la sua installazione dialoga in maniera molto diretta. Questo fino alle ore 20. Grazie.
Thank you and welcome. First of all, welcome Sara to the museum. We are very, very happy to have you here. And I will try to delineate a biography, a short introduction of Sara, starting from what is written on her website. Sara Sallam is a multidisciplinary artist who grew up in Egypt and now lives in the Netherlands. Her research-based practice includes photography, moving images, writing, voice narration, archival interventions, and bookmaking. Through her work, she focuses on retelling contested histories by imaging counter-narratives and exploring empathy, fiction, and temporal juxtapositions as ways to reclaim and decolonize her Egyptian heritage. And then it goes on also sketching a little bit of the education of Sara, and I will try to follow. I took some notes from the website before, and Sara speaks, understands, as she said, 6 languages, and starting at the age of 17, between 2008 and 2012, she won 3 times the Excellence Awards of the German University in Cairo when she was studying there. And these awards were covering summer courses of language, animation, and photography in Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin. So she could go to Germany and study already all this. And in 2013, she got a BA in media design at the German University in Cairo. Then she won many other grants and scholarships. She went to the UK to study also 1 year between 2015 and 2016. And she was awarded an MA in photojournalism and documentary photography at the London College of Communication. Then in 2016, she was working as a web and graphic designer in Cairo. And in 2017, she moved to the Netherlands. There, she studied, she went to the university in Leiden, and in 2019, she got a second MA, this time in film and photographic studies at the University of Leiden. So, Now, thinking in looking back to your career, now that you have already a long career behind you, how would you describe your artistic trajectory between your first works also in Cairo, what you did in Cairo, and the last works that you did in the Netherlands, but also in many museums in the world?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me and thank you for being here. I'm happy to return again to Turin and be in conversation with you, reflecting and retracing the journey leading to this work here. It's a very big question to go back in time to when I graduated in Egypt 2012 and 13. I was finishing my bachelor's there, and I was mostly trained as a designer. So my studies was multidisciplinary, so it combined many different disciplines, but the core of the study was design thinking, design research, and using different tools to solve problems in a design thinking way. And then in the last 2 years of my studies, when I had the freedom to choose what I want to do as my bachelor graduation project, I started leaning towards the documentary field. And that's why my bachelor project was a multi-screen documentary that was basically a video work that could be explored through an interactive website. So it was about interactive storytelling, from a website experience to the book experience and the video experience. And thematically, I was already drawn at that time to the historical narratives of Cairo. So my bachelor project was focused on the history of Cairo, narrated by a British Orientalist, 100 years from my current year at that time. And I was retracing how Stanley Lane Paul was describing his Cairo, and I was retracing it in my Cairo. And the following year after this project, we had in the German University in Cairo a pre-master's year where we could develop projects on our own initiative, and that's when I decided to focus on photojournalism, and I worked on my first photo documentary project.
Can you show something of these works from your website? Because they are really amazing. I was struck by these two works, Threads of Memories, that is about Cairo and how Cairo was perceived in an Orientalist way. And the other one is The Eye Sees Not Above the Brow, which was instead about social hierarchy and marginalized, invisible people living in Cairo on rooftops of Cairo buildings.
So I will let this run in the background. It's a video that I filmed in Cairo at that time, and it was fascinating for me at that time to be reading about the history of the city that I grew up in, and going to neighborhoods that I wasn't familiar with, and trying to see if there are traces of what this person was describing. And in a way, it wasn't a very critical work. It was really out of curiosity and trying to discover the history of these neighborhoods, and thinking about the gap between his perspective from the past with his own background and view on Cairo, and all the social issues that were present in my Cairo at that time. Also, as a young person with a camera roaming, or a girl roaming in the streets of Cairo, you encounter a lot of different things and people, and it was, I think, a very first exploration of how history shapes the present And also, maybe just briefly, it was also the first time that I worked with archival material.
Right. It's also very interesting because the choice of the photos that you made, showing these buildings today, the same spot where Stuart Paul was wandering and was describing, in comparison to old films. There's also a connection with a kind of touristic Egypt that was then also, there was an attempt to recreate something, especially in Babezuela, in that part of the city, to recreate the Cairo that was seen by Orientalists in the 19th century, and to give it to the tourists and to use it as a tourist attraction. And so conservation work on buildings, for instance, going back, trying to go back in time to when these buildings were in Mamluks times, were wonderful, amazing buildings. And while the photos that you show, or the footage that you filmed, is instead showing the more ugly modern buildings of those places, or otherwise they are seen from above. So there's a perspective that is not the same of maybe you had also, issues with people being filmed in the face, and so you chose that point of view. But anyway, it's quite different from the archival footage.
I think at that time I was not also very much, so it's difficult to speak of what I was thinking at that time versus what I'm thinking right now and looking back. But indeed, the focus for me, as someone who was navigating the streets with a camera, meeting people and bringing this archival material, I was interested in the people and my interactions with them, especially that with this project I also made a series of small videos called Observations in My City, and these short videos were really focused on the conversations that I had with the individuals that I met in the streets and their responses about the current issues that they deal with. And what you described about the interest in the preservation of the buildings and the interest in their histories and the divide between the city and the people, which was implicit and sometimes also explicit in the Orientalist vision, that modern Cairo is not connected to these beautiful buildings.
And this came up in another work that you did many years after.
Like 2 years ago, it emerged again in a different practice. But I think this early work sets the beginning of some of the issues that I later explore. And the other project that you mentioned also.
The interesting thing there is that you told me that you went back after a few years that you had studied abroad, you had been abroad, you went back to your first work and you changed your mind.
So this project is called The Eye Sees Not Above the Brow, and it's maybe let me stop at some slide here. So I worked on this during my bachelor's, and I was interested in documentary photography, and thematically I was interested in shedding light on something we do not see, what is invisible in a big city like Cairo, and I was drawn to kind of pay attention to communities that are marginalized, and that's also knowing that I grew up, at that time I was living in a neighborhood that had a dichotomy between different social classes. So you had really big gaps in income and gaps in the ways of living. So this was one way of consolidating these gaps. I wanted to merge more with the communities that were around me. And so this documentary project came up, and on the other side, I was also interested in photography, and the design thinker in me was looking into how can different photographic techniques document or portray situations in different ways because of their different technicalities. So I went to a group of a number of families who are living on the rooftops of Cairo. Most of these families are have migrated from the south of the country to the capital in search for better work opportunities. And most of them, not all of the ones I met, but most of them work as guardians of the building. And they were given living spaces on top of these buildings, very poor conditions. And I went there with the curiosity of a photographer, and I photographed how they were living. I had connections with them. I did some participatory photography. I was also exploring chemical photography, so I built a portable dark room on their rooftops in their houses, and they were helping me with the chemicals, and I was doing wet plates, so there was a lot of like messy chemicals, and it was a lot of play, but it was also an outsider documenting a different social class. And I wasn't aware of that power dynamic until I traveled 2 years later to do my master's in London. And there I studied the history and the burden of documentary photography. I learned more about this imbalanced power dynamic. And when I returned back after my master's, I revisited that project. I censored a lot of it and I reshaped it because it was not ethically okay. The practice that I was doing was not anymore aligned with my knowledge of what kind of problematics exist in this photographic encounter. So I was thinking at that time about the gaze, about my perception of their way of living, and I then only chose to keep the participatory photographs that resulted from our collaboration, and all the other photographs that I took were omitted from the project.
What do you mean for participatory photography?
So the images that are now on part of that project are the wet plates or the chemical photographs that I made with them, so they could choose where to be photographed, on which chair, in which corner of their house. They also saw the prints. They could adjust, and also because of the long exposure of this very sensitive technique that I wasn't also very skilled at. It was all about experimentation and staying still and not staying still, and then all of the different errors. They were at first errors, and then when I revisited the project, they encapsulated that collaboration. They encapsulated their uniqueness, they encapsulated their marginalization, and that's how the project became what it is. It became about the social classes and the difficulty to move between social classes, hence the title. The title is an Egyptian saying that means it's very difficult for the eye to to see. So it's about stagnation in social classes, and revisiting that project was also a learning moment for me. And somehow the themes of the gaze, not looking, the power dynamic, who is narrating, who has the power of showing, how can you subverse that gaze, that objectification, looking at misery. All of this was for me like a hands-on learning experience that started with this project and then seeps into a lot of my projects afterwards.
Yeah, that was already part of your, and became part of your also way of producing your artworks, and also the interest for the archive, in a way. So you were saying before that looking back to your trajectory, you can tell, for instance, there's one element in common of all your works, that is research, right?
Yeah. So after when I arrived in the Netherlands, I decided to follow another master's studies, and going to Faculty of Humanities was very challenging for me, because also my bachelor was very hands-on and very technical, and my master's in London was also theoretical, but it was a graduation project and not a thesis. So doing a visual thesis in the humanities was a challenge, but I really found it to be the mixture that I was mostly interested in, to have artistic projects that are grounded in research, that are starting with a question and an act of critical thinking, and very similar to design thinking, and then exploring which approaches match that concept that emerges from research. So overall, I think my design background, my interest in archives, my research practice, and then the artistic outcome, they all merge together in this fluid, I think, outcome of the different educations that I followed.
Yeah. So now I leave the stage to you and to show us a few of your artworks and projects. Okay?
Thank you. Time-wise? Why is this open? It should not be open. Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you again for being here. I have prepared a presentation of multiple projects of mine from the previous years that I'm glad to share with you. These would be Home Outside of Home, one of the projects that I started when I left Egypt, A Layer of Salt for My Oblivion, which was a result of a collaboration with the Royal Museums of Art and History in Brussels. At Last I Hold Your Gaze is the master's project that I worked on in Leiden. You Know My Name is a very recent project that I worked on in collaboration with the Middelhavsmuseet, the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm. And the last project is the one installed here at the Museo Egizio. These projects and my general practice touches on these very intertwined themes. A lot of it starts with a critical engagement with colonial practices, looking at the colonial past and how it is shaping and still shapes a lot of the practices we see in archaeology, in photographic archives, in museums, and the acts of extraction that are very central to colonialism are very much something that I explore as also an immigrant who left Egypt and is experiencing a form of displacement, even though I wasn't forcefully displaced. But this uprooting, this fracture is something that I explore personally, but also in relation to my heritage and its dispersion across different museums and countries all over the world. Issues that I often address are the gaze, who is being looked at, the representation, especially non-fictional representations in photographic work, but also sometimes I look into fictional representations and how the ancient Egyptian heritage and the ancient Egyptians themselves are represented, oftentimes dehumanized as artifacts and archaeological objects of study. Then if we go at the bottom part, some of the tools or methodologies that I explore are storytelling. So this idea of narratives as a way of engaging with that past. Decolonial listening is an act of listening to what is often not heard. So it's a way of looking at marginalized voices, trying to listen beyond hearing. Empathy is something central in my practice, an emotional engagement that is often not given space in scientific work, and archival interventions are ways of intervening with collage or with different materiality, experiments with materiality, a lot of different ways of disrupting the archives or kind of negotiating with it as acts of resistance and repatriation. So these are the general themes, and then I will go. I will try not to stay long with the project so that we can discuss them also at the end. But these are the themes that come across in multiple. Home outside of home. The first Egyptian mummified body brought to Holland arrived in the early 16th century. Some 500 years later, I moved to live there. Homesick, I found myself searching for Egypt in my new Western home. Strangely enough, I needed not to look for long. As I kept meeting my ancestors' belongings as objects accumulated in Western museums and archives, I wondered if these artifacts could speak. What would they say? I met a lonely fellow immigrant whose eyes were gazing into the distance. The loud engines of the never-ending flow of cars pivoting around her could not keep me from hearing her words of sorrow. She spoke of ropes wrapped around her, waves crashing against the boat that carried her, and farewell hymns sung by her crying sister on the day she was taken away from home. I heard the soft pleas of my ancestor echoing in the museum hallways. When looking into his eyes, I saw familiarity where many never seem sure whose face they see. Even whoever bought him in an auction for 200,000 euros did not know how much he has been missing the warmth of the Egyptian sun on his granite skin. A deep voice called me across the museum's atrium. There I found a proud man, eager for an audience. He immediately began boasting about shooting arrows with impeccable strength and rowing with unmatched speed down the Nile. I listened as his voice softened when he began recalling his youth in Memphis and the ancient pyramids piercing its lush landscape. He suddenly stopped, lost in thought, and spoke no more. I came across another traveler whose journey to Europe preceded mine by almost 200 years. He felt at home in his new surroundings of red brick and only wished the choice had been his for where he now lives. He kept asking incessantly about those he was forced to leave behind, wondering if they were permitted to remain with the sacred sands, within the sacred sands. This is a selection of photographic collages that I worked on, and it's still ongoing. All of these are informed by researching these objects that speak out to me when I encounter them in different museums and different cities. And then I try to engage in this decolonial listening, trying to listen to what their stories may be, what they may be wanting to talk about. Sometimes I connect through homesickness, other times I let the research inform the tone of my dialogue with these objects. And then the collage is either bringing them back into the location or the context where they were taken from, or offering them something back. So for example, here is the pyramid that was already preceding that pharaoh's time, so he would have seen it as a view in his time. And in a way, this recontextualization of the object, and not fully omitting its new location, but integrating it with its distant sister, for example, here, is something that I was exploring and continue to explore about recontextualization and decontextualization. What can I offer these objects back instead of just describing their difficulties, but also doing something for them? A layer of salt for my oblivion. From Saqqara we journeyed far, away from where we once stood tall, displaced from ancient sacred sands to lands where European breezes soar. Oh, how we wish we had been spared from the archaeologist's curious stare. There we would have remained whole, not a fragmented body in a plaster cast. Once covered with spells and prayers inscribed on our porous skin, now we breathe the humid air, finding in it our rebellious skin. We inhale deeply to let the moisture seep in, freeing the salts we hold within and slowly fading in silent protest. One day they will look at us and see no line, stroke, or color relief. Would they then understand our plea to return once more to Nefertir Tenef scare? It's a difficult name. This project is related to mastaba, an ancient tomb structure that was excavated and extracted from Saqqara, from Egypt, and brought all the way to Belgium. In this photograph, we see the archaeologist Jean Capard, who was at that time, early 1905, I think, was allowed to choose a mastaba worthy of his museum. He saw several mastabas, and he had the choice of which one was large enough, beautiful enough, solid enough that can withstand the move, and he decided which of the stones to remove. Because of funding, he had a specific budget, and therefore only the beautiful stones were taken and the rest was left behind. And the location of this tomb is now unknown. There is like a map with a mark on it, but no one knows exactly where this tomb is, because what was left behind was not considered worthy. He found in this tomb a coffin that didn't have any inscriptions on it, and the body. And because it didn't have any inscriptions, there was no indication of who the body belonged to, and therefore the coffin, the body, and all the stones that didn't have beautiful inscriptions were left behind. And in the Museum of Arts and History in Brussels, the cast of this tomb is now standing. So all the original bricks in a cast to be visited there. And in my project, I excavated the archive, the photographic archive that Jean Capard was collecting. And I was interested in retracing that move of this mastaba, and my interaction with the archive resulted in a small discovery. One of the conservators in the museum shared that the conservators in the 40s, but maybe 50s after the war, I'm not sure, they were struggling to maintain the quality of the inscriptions on these stones in the museum, because the stones were absorbing the humidity in the air, and that was causing the salinization of their surfaces, so salts were rising and the colors were fading, and that became the way that the stones communicated with me, because I was standing long inside of this structure, this cast, this broken structure in the museum, thinking, what does it want me to tell about its journey? And it wasn't a story about displacement or being broken. It was a story of resistance. They were actively rejecting their beautification. They were resisting this archaeological category of being worthy, and they were removing their inscriptions as an act of rebellion. And therefore I started to interact and mimic their gesture onto the photographic archives by rubbing salts and stone dusts onto the prints to damage the prints, in a way visualizing their rebellion. At last I hold your gaze. You disturbed my eternal slumber. You carried me out of my chamber. You shipped me off on a sailing boat and placed me in your bustling establishment. There I met your camera's lens for the first time. You laid me on the marble floor and slowly set your recording apparatus to face my ancient figure. You dedicated your time to carefully examine my body. No longer sacred, it became the object of your study. Now I have grown accustomed to your cold examination tables, your narrow scanning machines, your burning spotlights, your suffocating glass vitrines, and the ceaseless shutters invading my body and capturing its every detail, be it a fracture, a dent, a scar. You have long been looking at me, but here at last I hold your gaze. This project was part of my dissertation at the University of Leiden, and I was at that time analyzing and looking at the non-fictional archaeological representations of ancient Egyptian bodies in the museum context, and I was arguing that the way that they were being photographed systematically in this forensic, medical, scientific, objective approach results in their dehumanization. We no longer perceive that they are human remains, but we perceive them as artifacts, as objects. The intervention with the archival material that I was gathering to show how this way of portrayal was systematic until now was basically trying to not to duplicate, yet still address, but not to duplicate the violence in this portrayal, and at the same time negotiate how can I criticize it but still not duplicate it. And so I started covering the unwrapped human remains first digitally with linen, digital linen, so photographic collage, and then I printed the images again, and then I placed sand that I brought from Egypt, so I was working in the Netherlands, and rephotographed these images buried, hinting at the reburial of these individuals. Along with these photographs, I wrote monologues, imagining the perspective of the photographed individuals talking back to the archaeologists photographing them. So in this moment, they challenged that gaze. In one of the chapters of this project, which became a book, there is a chapter about mummified children. You did not spare my child. How difficult it was to see you finding him. You opened his coffin after I had tucked it away decades ago. The agony I felt when you held the child I mourned for so long. My heart ached when I saw you taking off the wrappings that I rolled around him in tears. If only I could rush towards him, cover him with my own linen, and bury him once again. Oh, the sorrowful sight of his fragile body lying in front of you, bare and naked. That thesis informed a couple of other projects that I later worked on. One of them is a recent project called You Know My Name. The day I woke from my long slumber, that day everything was trembling. Perhaps I showed a video instead of reading, because there is a video. So I will come to the reading later. This project was a very difficult project because it dealt with a mummified child who is currently on display at the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm, where I was invited to do an intervention with the gallery, with the room where he was on display. My journey was first looking into the journey, that my journey was in a way retracing the child's journey and looking at all of the different events that shaped his afterlife in life. So the moment of being removed from the grave by a Swedish priest, Vesco, who's in the photograph here, and retracing his journey showed me all of the difficulties that we do not consider as difficulties when we just think of a souvenir being brought back from an adventurous trip. In this case, the priest was bringing back, along with other souvenirs, a mummified child, traveling back to Stockholm, where he had the child displayed in his own school and then donated to another school. That child was an exhibit, a spectacle for children to look at next to other mummified birds and curiosities. Later on, the child is taken along with other mummified human remains in Stockholm to a couple of hospitals, and as part of a research project. Looking into the what can we learn about the mummified remains that are currently in Sweden, and this large project means that the child is then exposed to X-rays and CT scans, being invaded with all of these so-called non-invasive imaging techniques, because the shift was from unwrappings. He was partially unwrapped in the beginnings of his presence in Sweden, but now at that period, I'm talking 2010s, and the first X-rays were 1960s, so in that period with technological advancements, the interest was in preserving the object, but still wanting to know, wanting to see, and therefore all of these different imaging processes are enacted onto the body of that child, who remains on display in the museum. in my project, I wanted to not only retrace the journey, I wanted to shift our attention from the medical obsession that is wanting to know what happened, the scientific curiosity, the conservators' challenges, and looking at their causes of death, the dating of this child, the age, all of these different specifics that are very important to the archaeologist, but not necessarily to his mother, who had to bury him and wrap him. So I'm going to show a short, I hope sound-wise it will work, the first 3 minutes of that video.
Raise yourself, O Osiris. Place yourself on your side. Let me pour water beneath you and place these amulets for you to rejoice.
The day I woke from my long slumber, that day everything was trembling. The wind carried everything. The sand was dancing in the air. Then it became a cold, wet storm, like nothing I had ever seen before. I heard the sound of water, of waves. They were harsh and strong, captivating the man who stood beside me. Oddly dressed, his eyes fixed on the sea. As the land drew near, he turned around and said to me, "We're home at last, my Egyptian princess." He was home, but I was drifting away from you. In the video, what we are hearing is the imagined perspective of that child narrating to his mother. And in the background, what you're hearing is my mother reciting ancient Egyptian prayers that are associated with the amulets that are found in the boy's wrappings. And the act of pouring wax and the intervention with these photographs is kind of, in a way, trying to give him protection through these amulets that are covered inside of his remains, inside of his wrappings, and which are currently the subject of curiosity inside of an autopsy, digital autopsy table that is present next to his remains. So in the museum, there is a table where visitors can unwrap the child, and at the end of the unwrapping, you see these amulets. And in my work, I wanted to bring back the power of these amulets as protective protectors of the body, and together with my mother chanting that their powers are activated, soothing the child who is also next to that artwork and the table. Lastly, the work that I hope you will or have already seen in the museum, the installation is called "The Sun Weeps for the Land and Calls from the Garden of Stones." There once were sisters, 730 sisters, all gathered with their toes immersed deep in the warm Egyptian sand. There once were sisters, 730 sisters, all filling temples dedicated to the sun and their devoted king, Amenhotep III. There once were men who traveled far and met these sisters. With curious eyes and eager hands, the men dug the earth to make these sisters their own. There once were men with power over the land and stones. They removed 21 sisters from their roots, rupturing and breaking the circle of sisters. This project is 3 components, but at the center of this comes a response to this engraving that depicts Drovetti, an excavator, a consul for the French in Egypt, and the field men around him that were helping in the excavation. You see a lot of different problematic hierarchies between the field men and their assistants, between locals and foreigners, between the archaeologist and the artifact, between the archaeologist and the land. And I wanted to unpack these hierarchies, at least some of them, and address them in my installation here. The first work is a collage that responds directly to this painting or illustration and portrays the act of extraction and the act of wounding the earth in order to extract and remove these statues. Here, the juxtaposition is between different archival imagery from different periods of time. The illustration that captures Drovetti in the land, in the space there, but also photographs that were taken in later excavations that resulted in Amenhotep III's body being also extracted and also displayed in a museum in Cairo. The act here that I wanted to focus on is the violence that we do not perceive when we think of, or when we look at artifacts in museums. We do not think of the wounding, of the rupture that this intervention with the landscape causes. And here in blue are the 21 Sekhmet statues that are currently on display in this museum, next to the artwork. The 21 statues that are being here portrayed in the act of being found and removed and left, taken on boats, leaving their original burial or temple spaces and being relocated, leaving Egypt and arriving all the way here, is part of the three components of the work. The second component is prayer beads, in which I try to visualize the magnitude of this sculpture project that Amenhotep III commissioned, making 730 statues depicting the goddess Sekhmet seated and standing. And we can no longer perceive this magnitude because they are dispersed all over the world in this museum, but also in a lot of museums outside and inside of Egypt. And the repetitive act is something that I wanted to portray here, and using the cyanotype technique, a photographic technique that is linked to the sun, links back to the original purpose or the connection of this deity in relation to the sun god. The third component is the video work that starts with the act of extracting these 21 statues from the temples in Egypt, visualized in the same language as the collage, and they are getting removed from the landscapes, from the temples, and then arriving in the museum space here. And then they meet my intervention in a performative act inspired by an ancient Egyptian ritual that activates the statues and at the same time creates a dialogue, a ritual using sound, using sense, using light, using chemicals to create copies of these 21 statues as photographic prints that can leave the museum unlike these statues. And then I brought these 21 prints back to Egypt in a sort of procession that goes through the temples where they originally came from, down from Luxor all the way to Aswan, where they were originally carved in the quarry. And in the quarries, the ancient quarries of Aswan, I rebury these prints as an act of repatriation, returning them again to the stone, to visualize their agony for not having been able to protect the king. They were supposed to be a closed circle, praying, offering, protection day and night, 730, 365, how do I say the math? Basically day and night, year long, they were supposed to be performing a litany, a protection. And now that they are dispersed, they can no longer do that. And in this act of reburial, I hint at a potential rebirth, and maybe in their next life, they can perform what they were meant to do, their original purpose, to protect the king. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the stage also to questions. So if there are questions from the public, please do them. And otherwise, I will start also with a few questions. I have many, and so I have to choose between the many questions. One thing is that we saw that your artistic trajectory moved in a way from displaying your artworks that were mainly photographic prints or handcraft books, and maybe in art centers or photo centers, and it moved towards displaying your artworks in museums, and also in tight connection with the objects of those museums, because your artworks were commissioned by the museums. And anyway, your production is a strong critique also of museum collections and how they display objects or human remains and how they were formed in history. So now, what is your relationship then with museums?
Okay. I think the shift from making works about museums to making works in museums has also resulted in another shift in my practice, from making projects about the objects, about the artifacts, about those that I'm trying to listen to making works for them. And that's when I started to think about what can I offer the objects, the artifacts, because of the new access that I have to them by working in the museum. So on the one hand, I think the invitation to come and criticize the museum is a privilege, but it comes also with its challenges in relation to choosing of the vast history where to focus on, trying to feel the pulse of the museum, what is currently happening with the conservators, with the curators, what are their current, what are they currently focusing on, and what can I poke and tease, and where can I respond critically, so not just as an outsider, but as someone who can see what is currently happening. And also because of the affinity that I have in my practice with research and excavating archives, there is a connection between my work and the work of the archaeologists and the curators that adds to the complexity of my task in a way, but also keeps it intriguing for me. How can I respond critically while relating, but to the challenges that the museum faces, but also to address the history and search for where is the focus not paid or like placed. And I try to do that by focusing on what can I offer the objects, how can I tell stories that they want to tell and not necessarily that the museum wants to tell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. But is there also a shift in the sense that criticizing the museum from outside, you might not always get the perspective of the curators, because something is what the museum as an institution decides to display and the way it decides to display the objects. And another thing is the internal point of view and perspective of even many different curators that are many different persons.
Yeah.
So it's no longer, you get also something of the perspective that not necessarily is explicitly displayed to the public.
Yeah,
by
definitely.
working from inside the museum.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, a lot of my projects are also collaborative, because I do engage in a lot of dialogues with curators of the different museums. For example, A Layer of Salt for My Oblivion. The whole visual concept comes from the experiences of the conservators and the challenges that wouldn't have been accessible to me only through their work and having that access to know what they were challenged with, that I could actually connect with the artifacts. So I think in a way that access is it can be beneficial, this collaboration for sure. It informs a lot of my conceptual work, but it can also be challenging to separate at some point myself from what the different curators see as the important aspects to focus on. Everyone is very passionate about their work, so how can I stand back and look without being fascinated with the archaeological work or the curatorial work or the archives and the excitement of finding archival material that was recently discovered. All of this is also difficult to keep a distance from at some point and offer critique. So I think it's a privilege mixed with a challenge and a lot of excitement through the collaborations.
Right. And I love that you, on your website, you use the definition research, artist researcher.
Yeah.
And as an artist researcher, you are well aware that all the documentation and the data that you use to create your artworks, they come from Egyptology. So from the discipline that you criticize as a Western enterprise and so on, as a biased Western enterprise. So how do you cope with that? You are using this information and you are also criticizing the science that is behind the production, so the knowledge production of the discipline.
I think perhaps most of my work is contextualizing this material and looking at that origin story. A lot of these archival photographs call us to look at their content and not necessarily what is outside of the frame. And so far I have been, I think in most of my projects, trying to look outside of that frame, trying to bring back to the center what has not been the center, whether it's the people, whether it's the humanness of the remains, and so on and so forth. And I think perhaps, in response to your question, my next step is to
become an Egyptologist.
No, I was more thinking about searching within the Egyptian community for the local language. For, in a way, what I'm trying to say is that I'm using now this material to address what they are lacking, but the next step could be to use a different material, to use non-Western records, looking into archives beyond the Western canon, looking into visual languages, and I think this could be my next chapter. Right now I've been exploring the contextualization, acknowledging the colonial origin, the context, and all the violence that is neglected when we deal with this material, but I think the next chapter would be to
change language.
Change the language. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
A challenge.
Are there questions from the public? Yeah?
Yes. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was incredible.
Great.
Your exposition. I have a kind of a question. I just think it's interesting, like what you were talking right now about this separation, like with the curator and like the, maybe I got it wrong, but like the artistical experience, which I find curious. Like I was thinking how a science and art in general, like always divided, except that they are not really different at all. They were one and the same for like millennia. Isn't there a way that maybe they can converge together? Because at the end, I mean, maybe my opinion is a bit biased because I'm an anthropologist with an archaeological background. But like when we see these places like the museums at the end, we go here to learn and to understand, like hotel cultures and like how people live, and we realize how like they influence us even nowadays despite like the distance and the time. So it's kind of like a miracle. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. So like I guess my question is like, why should they be apart? Like this is a scientific part, like the science and the storytelling, like shouldn't they converge always? Like aren't they always like together?
Yeah, totally clear.
Yeah. I mean, from a curatorial point of view, yes, they should be together, but they are not now. And what we are missing in museums is precisely this other kind of perspective on the objects. And also the fact that we come to museums to learn, but what are you learning is only the narratives that curators decide and choose and select. And the objects that you see are only the objects that curators select and decide to display. So there's always something that is missing, that is not told. There are so many stories there. And
I think that's precisely what I try to do, because I start with a scientific process. I start a research process, looking into the archival material, looking at what do we know, what do scholars write about these objects, what are they currently researching, what are they currently trying to discover. And a lot of my work is about reshaping and recentering. So instead of maybe focusing on that aspect that they have been focused on, I still use that research and try to channel it into a different form. So I think your question about that separation is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to use artistic approaches of storytelling, of photographic interventions, of different techniques to actually put the scientific knowledge in dialogue with human experiences. So it's not devoid of the human aspect, it's not devoid of the emotional. All of these spiritual knowledges that, let's say, they have been deemed as less scientific while they are sources of knowledge. So I'm trying to use the artistic approaches to look at the scientific material and merge them in a way that is engaging on a human-to-human approach, kind of. I don't know if that...
Yes, I mean, it answered the question.
Thank you.
I mean, regarding what you're saying, in your experience, in your work, working with museums, how receptive have the museums where you have been, like, work with, how has it been? Like, how possible it will be for this perspective to be, like, you know, more common all over the world? Maybe that's too ambitious, but I mean, I would like to know.
I think so far I've been invited by multiple museums that are eager for having this alternative perspective or different perspective than what the museum usually has. And in terms of their reception to my ideas, so far I haven't had any restraints from the outside. Like, I feel that my challenge is how I restrain myself, because I feel that I'm invited in the museum. Even though I am invited to criticize the museum, there is still a power dynamic of who is inviting who, and that difficulty is still there. It's implicit. I haven't been in an experience where it was made explicit, where the concept was too critical, or no, we cannot do that. This didn't happen, but it is in the back of my head, and I think it's still inherent in that structure where the museum, as an authority, has the power to invite and to decide who is allowed to speak inside of it. There is still some control and some decision making that is not on the same eye-to-eye level, but it's implicit in my situation. Maybe there are other artists who have different experiences, but the power dynamic is still there.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to do another question, that is ancient Egyptians as ancestors. We have it in the title, and it's the basic idea of many of your works. So do you think this is a widespread sentiment also in Egypt today, or not? Because I don't feel to be related to ancient Romans, for instance.
Yeah. I think one of the easiest answers that I can give is yes, because of the way that the history unfolded in recent history, so recent as in like colonialism and the movements to rid Egypt from foreign manipulation. I'm talking about revolutions that were against the British occupation. Pharaonism was a movement that brought Egyptians together to push and rebel against colonial powers, and that notion of using ancient Egypt as a unifying aspect of Egyptians, to not look at religion differences, to not look at different social classes, to unify the origin to ancient Egypt to something that all Egyptians are proud of. I think this is still present. What I try to address to the Egyptians is that this notion of pride is kind of shaped still within the archaeological domain, meaning that the ancient Egyptians are perceived as ancestors, but not as necessarily in the same category as more recent ancestors. They still fall under the same, they fall under the category of artifacts and archaeological remains. So Egyptians still adopt that perspective in the field, in the groundwork. But I think it's still very much present that Egyptians relate to their ancestors.
So what would you reply to people telling you that modern and ancient people are not related, and that ancient Egyptian heritage is world heritage of humanity and needs to be kept as that?
Yeah, I would say that there is a neglect of the notion of land as a shared space of culture, of ideas, of proximity, of connection, of you can debate ancestry in relation to biological terms, or saying that the current Egyptians are not in terms of DNA connected to the ancient Egyptians anymore, or something like that. But I think that the connection really comes from the Nile, from the land, from the space, from all of this locality that somehow is neglected as a way of connection. And I think the separation between modern contemporary Egyptians, or modern Egypt, and ancient Egypt was intentional in colonial times. And yes, Egyptians at some point in time lost the knowledge of what their ancient ancestors made, and there was some gap, but that doesn't mean that there was no connection. So I would say that it doesn't matter if the bloodline is broken, because I think the land connects the current people with the ancient people.
Okay, great. We are, I think, late, and so already late. And so thank you again, Sara Sallam. Let's give her a round of applause. And now we invite for the remaining time, which is a little time, but we invite the people here to go and see the installation of Sara in the museum. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.